Good evening. Hope you've had a good week, and I'm relatively colorblind when it comes to our two state schools, and I root for both of them appropriately. Growing up in Sayre, there were at one time basketball players from Hammond, which was a little bitty school, and Big Country, and so the Sooners were playing the Cowboys in basketball, and my mom was up, and I said, "Mom, who are you for?" And she said, "I'm for who has the ball." Well, that's pretty good. And she wanted the kids from the little schools, whether they're from Hammond or from the other side of the state, to do well, and there was having two teenage girls. This only happened a couple of times, but I told the girls, Dad needs another layer or something. Well, one of my daughter's husband, they are such Sooners, they can't root for the OSU ping pong team. I mean, they're red through and through, and he had a heart scare, was in Baptist hospital, and they were dorm parents at OC, and so Michael was going to OU, and Annalise was doing marriage and family in Stillwater. And so Annalise came in a hurry to check on her father-in-law, and she had Pistol Pete on the front of her. And he, father-in-law was going to be okay. And just in the same tone that when she was a teenager, I said, "Sweetheart, Dad needs another layer." Her father-in-law said, "Sweetheart, do you have a jacket?" And she said yes, and he said, "Would you please put that on? I wouldn't want any of my friends to see you with that thing on your chest." And so, some families are all red or all orange, and hopefully we can still get along. What I'd like to do tonight, and there's going to be some overlap with some of the earlier things, but I'd like for us to kind of walk through the Jewish calendar and just to have a sense of where things took place and how they unfolded. And most of you will have an outline, but like I said, there's some out front and some there. Do want to mention this as well, and this will come up another times. On our tables, this is a reading schedule. If you've not done one of these, we still want to encourage people to be reading through. And our new website, Kevin and Kyle especially have put a lot of work in that, is about to come out. And our classes from last year will be there, so if you want to read through the narrated Bible again and occasionally listen to a class, you'll be able to do that. And what I want us to do as we do this is just kind of to get a feel for the flow of the year, how a year unfolded. And we're going to officially look at this a little bit later, but let me just start here. The civil year began in October. And because Greek and Roman influences, when we think of the new year, we obviously think of January. And, the Roman god Janus was the coin, where it was a god who faced both ways. And hence our name for January is taken from the Roman god Janus, because it was a god that was depicted as a face looking both directions. And that's why January is named that. And I think it's helpful, though, for us to get something of the rotation, the seasons, the things that happen. And so we're going to look initially, and as we come to the annual festivals, we've covered these in the past. We won't spend a lot of time on those. But the religious year is actually going to start in October, and we're going to have three things. We're going to have the blowing of trumpets. There's like a feast of trumpets, and then there's going to be the Day of Atonement, and we're going to stop and look at that a little bit because that deserves an entire separate lesson. And then after the Day of Atonement is going to be the feast, and you fill in the blanks. It's either the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles or Ingathering. And you'll see this taking place in John chapter 7. Jesus is there, and this is the equivalent of the Jewish Thanksgiving. It's the end of the year in terms of all the crops are in, all the festival things have taken place. And so I want you to start thinking that in the Jewish system, the civil year is going to begin in October. And then the events that we're going to go through the year, and some you'll be familiar with, and some we're not as familiar with. So we'll do that cycle. We'll go through just a year and say, okay, these are the things that took place. But then after that, there's a sabbatical year. So every 7th year, you don't plant crops. And you talk about an act of faith. You know, if God says, if you do this, I'll supply enough for you the 6th year. You do not plant the 7th year. If things come up, there's, agriculturally, the word is called fallow ground, to let something rest for a year. And so every 7th year, there was going to be no planting, as long as they followed Scripture and followed God's word. And then on the 50th year is going to be the year of Jubilee. And you're going to have like a 49th and a 50th year that they don't plant. And so those are things that we're not quite as familiar with, so that's what we're going to do in terms of that cycle. When we moved to Australia in April, we're moving into the heart of autumn. And like I said initially, waking up on the 4th of July and seeing your breath and the sun going down like it is now, just after 5 o'clock, took a while to adjust to. And then I was at a garden center, and the guy said, mate, he said, don't put your tomatoes out till the 1st of September so the frost doesn't get them. And I thought, that's just what I've heard all my life. Don't put tomatoes out till the 1st of September so the frost doesn't get them. But then what I hadn't really noticed is that you stop and think, what happens here in August? And you look at all the series of things that just kind of naturally lead us into the end of the year. School starts. Football starts, autumn comes, and then we start doing this sequence, and we'll do Halloween, Thanksgiving, and then Christmas. None of those things happen in Australia. Somewhere October-ish, November, as you're heading into spring and everything's blooming and the springtime has come, the first really warm day, you'll hear someone say, oh, it's getting hot, it's getting close to Christmas. And as we said before, the children are told at the equator, Santa unhooks the reindeer and sends them back because they'll hyperventilate in the southern hemisphere. And he hooks on a boomer as a male kangaroo, and he hooks on 6 white boomers to bring the sled into Australia because those poor reindeer will hyperventilate in 100-plus degree weather. And that's just a part of the calendar year. We went to summer church camp the 2nd day after Christmas. Doesn't that sound right? Summer church camp. You've got to have Christmas, and you got to have Boxing Day, the British holiday, and then we got to get everything ready and organized because summer church camp starts the 2nd day after Christmas. And we would always pray in the new year, the last night of church camp. And then January was a month off, and then school starts in February. And I think about this in terms of Jesus. We're not sure exactly when this happens, but at what point is he cognizant of the distinction between living in Nazareth and what goes on in heaven? You know, some will wonder, did this happen finally when the Spirit descends on him in his baptism? But even when you hear echoes of things as early as 12, you know, Mom, didn't you know? And fill in the blank. It's either my Father's house or my Father's business. There's a cognizance of what's going on in heaven in his mind. And when we talked about this Sunday, the Word becomes flesh. Every time I'm in a strange environment, in a strange situation, I just think I need to do this one day at a time, make the adjustment to a new place, to a new schedule, to a new time, to a new congregation, and do it one day at a time, and let the Word become flesh in doing that. So God directed, and this is the first asterisk, the men of Israel to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year for seasonal feasts. The only fast that is actually prescribed is the Day of Atonement. And I said this earlier, and like I said, this part's kind of a repeat. This is a dangerous thing to do, but in this case it works. If you put 2 hyphens in, this is the day of Atonement. And it's the only prescribed fast in the year. And before the high priest goes in, and he will offer sacrifices for himself, for his family, There's going to be bulls that are going to be offered. We're going to have the scapegoat. We're going to confess the people's sins over the head of the goat. He's going to be taken out into the wilderness. And then once a year, he is allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. And incense is to be there, and it's a very, very sacred thing. And what is interesting, by the time you come to the New Testament, the Pharisees are fasting twice a week. And the highest percentage that I've read so far, and these have to be guesstimates and estimates, but the highest percentage that I've read so far is that maybe only 10% of the population were Pharisees. Because they survived the fall of Jerusalem, and Yohanan ben Zakkai is carried out in a coffin, and the Pharisees continue, all the rest of the Jewish groups are destroyed, literally, in the fall of Jerusalem. And the Pharisees, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. The Pharisees are the major competition with the Christians, both in the ministry of Jesus, and they're the group of Judaism that survives into the centuries after that. But here's something that I want us to start with and to end with today. The feast and the activities were seasons of rejoicing. And if it's this Deuteronomy 16, it may be another one as well. But it's in the book of Deuteronomy concerning the Feast of Booths and Tabernacles. You are to do this with joy and rejoicing. And as we mentioned in our devotional last week, this is the earliest time that we're introduced to the word joy in Scripture. And it had to do with collective worship. And when we get together for this wonderful feast in the autumn time of the year, then and that's why it's so important, because this word feast is something that is so much a part of the regular cycle of Jewish life, as long as they kept the law as God gave it to them. So here's the weekly festivals, and the first one is going to be the Sabbath. And I want to just read through the paragraph and then talk about this, because I don't know how much you have talked with, and there's more than one group, but when I say Seventh-day Adventist, I have a dear, dear friend in Australia named Dallas, and he is a wonderful person. Every time, coming or going, the name of God is on his lips. Either God bless you, or God be with you, or God help you. And I want to talk some about that, because if you talk with people who believe that we should be keeping the Sabbath today, there's certain very specific things that they believe to get to that conclusion, and we'll save that till we've read through this. So here's the Sabbath. Every week, the seventh day was sanctified by God at creation, but is not observed until the time of the Exodus. So as the people come out of Egypt, then they're to start observing the Sabbath, and it's actually going to be a part of the law of Moses. The Sabbath commemorated both the Lord's rest at creation and the deliverance from Egyptian slavery. The Sabbath was a sign between Jehovah and Israel, and this to me is really, really critical. God didn't make the covenant of Moses with all of mankind. It's only made with the Israelites. And if you remember when we talked about this, they're at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses has gone up, has received the 10 Commandments. He has come down. And my vote for the biggest whopper in the Bible is, golly, it jumped out of the fire. Moses, we just collected some gold, and this calf just jumped out of the fire. No wonder Moses is so distraught. But shortly after that, it's going to be in Exodus 24 and verse 8, the people are assembled, they start reading the law, and at a certain point the people say in 24:8, all the words of this covenant we will keep. And literally, Moses is going to have basins of blood, and he's going to hurl the blood on the people who are closest to them. And the covenant that contains the Sabbath day was never made with all of humanity. But we'll come back to that in just a second. Special offerings are going to be made on the Sabbath. We've noticed this recently. Every day, they're to offer a lamb in the morning and a lamb in the evening in the tabernacle, just all through the week. And then on the Sabbath, they're to add another lamb, so 2 more lambs are sacrificed every Sabbath. So if the Sabbath is kept according to the law, then 4 lambs are sacrificed every Sabbath. And again, the Sabbath was to be a joyful time. When you talk with someone who feels like we should keep the Sabbath day today, and this is fairly typical, they will start talking about, well, there's 3 parts of the law of Moses. There's the civil part, the regulation of the government. There's the sacramental, the ceremonies, the sacrifices is the second part. And they will say both of these 2 have been taken away, but since God wrote the 10 Commandments and gave them to Moses, the moral law is what's eternal. And so when you talk with someone who wants to have the Sabbath day, they don't want to sacrifice animals. And they'll say, oh, Jesus did away with that. And so they will then subdivide the Old Testament into 3 different groups, and they'll say the civil part, the ceremonial, the sacrifices are done away with, but the moral law is the 10 Commandments, and that's what's eternal. When Paul writes in Galatians 3, he says, he who offends in one part of the law offends in all. If you don't keep the whole law, then that's sinful. And a part of the reason why we don't sacrifice is the old covenant's been done away, but that's also the same reason why we don't observe the Sabbath day as a Saturday weekly observance. Having said that, there are a few things that would help us any more spiritually than to have a day where we rested. And I'm not saying Saturday. I'm just saying when I use the word Sabbath rest, I'm just talking about a time of rest. Even when we had small children, there'd be sometimes I'll say, okay, I'll get them to bed. You go to bed, you do whatever you want to do, and then I'll look after them, I'll help with breakfast, and you'll just have this time completely off, and I'll take care of the kids just to give you a chance to rest. And I didn't have a normal raising in that my dad normally woke up between 4 and 4:30 virtually every morning. He would let us sleep in until 5:30. That was later in the day. And for 25 years, he was the head crop hail adjuster for Oklahoma Farm Bureau. So if you have a wheat field, it gets hailed on, my dad and other people would come and would do the adjustment on the field. So he might leave Sunday night after church and drive 4 hours to Enid, or he might get up at 3:30 and drive to Enid. But he would work from daylight till dark, all the way through at least Friday, and then would go get a bite to eat and would fill out all the paperwork. And then Kelly, I'll be at the East Field when the sun comes up, and he'd work from daylight to dark. So when he came home, he'd say, "No, son, if on Sunday morning, if we start at 4:30, we can put in a half a day's rest half a day's work before we go rest at church." So there were times we'd get up at 4:30. We always had 6 to 8 cows to milk. We had to do all the chores and everything. And then we would try to put in 6 to 8 hours of work before church. And you take an Old Spice shower when you get in. You take off all your farm clothes. You wash your hands. You put on some Old Spice and your church clothes, and you head to church. And then we could work Sunday afternoon, and then he would leave and be gone, and then would work for the rest of the week. When we started dating, Sheila said, "What do you do for fun?" And I said, "Well, what's that?" She said, you just do something for fun." I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, do you fish?" And I said, "Yes, but we kept a fishing pole next to our farming equipment, and then you stop and you fish, and you just keep working." Every family's different, but the Christian race is more of a marathon than a sprint. And all of us will have things that we go through in our lives where one of the best things we can do is rest. Jamie, how much change has your folks gone through in the last 12 months? I mean, you just start looking at all the things that happen to a family in a relative period of time. I'm sending an article tonight to Australia, and they ask, what happens in the life of a minister during funerals? Thankfully, this has only happened 3 times, but I've had a funeral on Monday, on Wednesday, and on Friday. So 3 times I've had 3 funerals in a week. Had a Wednesday night class, a Sunday morning class, and 2 sermons on Sunday. Can I say, leaving the lights on the car all night, and the poor battery kind of goes, rrr, rrr. And after I did it the first week, I went home Wednesday. Thankfully, it was a morning funeral, and I went to bed because I'm going to need to rest to get through the rest of the week. And I don't know what it is in our lives, but there are always times where we're never at our best, when we're just really tired and exhausted, and having a regular time to rest spiritually and physically is really, really important. So when I talk with people about a Sabbath rest, I'm not talking about keeping the Sabbath day. And by the time of the New Testament, we'll find in Acts chapter 1 and verse 12, oh, this was about a Sabbath a day's journey, about 7/10 of a mile. And then here's the last thing, and we won't spend as much time on any of the rest of them. But as I've said before, there's not a person alive today that can keep the law of Moses if they wanted to. Because after the temple's destroyed, and then after Islam comes in, they build the Dome of the Rock on the site of the temple, and there's not, even if you want to, you can't keep the Sabbath a day as was given by Moses. But this was a weekly part of their lives and was a very spiritual part as kept as God gave it. There's a new moon monthly festival, and we're not as familiar with this, but special offerings are demanded at the beginning of the month. Blowing of trumpets are associated with this, and it continued into the latter part of the Old Testament, into the time of Nehemiah. So we're going to have a weekly Sabbath. We're going to have a monthly new moon. Then we've looked at these 3 in previous times, so we'll do these very quickly. But Passover is going to be the remembering of God's deliverance of the people from Egyptian bondage. And you're going to have, after the Passover feast and those celebrations, there's going to be 7 days of unleavened bread. And then during the return of the kings and the people who are involved, there's going to be these huge celebrations of the Passover. The Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A-H, is written between 200 to 300 AD. And after the destruction of Jerusalem and after all the things that are happening, people get to thinking, our people are going to lose our Jewish traditions. And so they would write a list of all these different either commands or interpretations of different rabbis through the centuries. And one of them was that before the Sabbath day, before the Passover, if you don't have a light, you take a candle and you make sure there's no leavened bread, no crusts in your house. So especially if you have small kids, you need to look under the bed, whatever else. And when you talk about unleavened, the whole house is to be unleavened, and then there's to be a feast of 7 days. 50 days later is the Feast of Pentecost. And so it's 7 Sabbaths plus 1, and that's how we know in Acts 2 that the Lord's church has started on the Lord's Day, because up to that point they're going to observe the Passover, and there will be a Saturday countdown, and you'll do 7 times 7, 49, and then the 50th day will be the first day of the week. And there's to be special offerings to be made, no work is to be done, and it was to be a day holy and rejoicing. And then here's the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths, and this is the time when God's people camped out. And you've heard me use the term Boy Scout Jamboree. This is what I think of when I do go through and read this. The Boy Scout Jamborees that I went to, there'd be, troops of scouts from all these different places, but campfires and things being cooking and people working on merit badges, and it was just a great time of people enjoying being together. And they're to come to Jerusalem after all the harvests are finished, and they are to build shelters, booths, camp out type thing for this entire week. and remember that God's people lived in tents when they came out of Jerusalem. I went to Memphis a number of years in October, and one of my friends lived at the same place, and there was a park across from him. And there's a strong Jewish population in Memphis. And I asked him one day, I said, what's going on in the park? He said, oh, there are Jews who are still observing the Feast of Booths and the Feast of Ingathering. And so their version of it is that they go camp out in the park for these 7 days. And some of them go to work and do other stuff, but they are still observing that part of that festival and that feast. And then, as we mentioned, the Day of Atonement. And this is the 10th day of the 7th month. And this commemoration of being able to come into the presence of God is very, very significant. After the exile, so the people are sent into captivity. The first time Jerusalem's conquered is 606. Then Nebuchadnezzar comes back in 598, and they rebel again. And then he comes back in 587, 86 and destroys the city. And as Jeremiah said, the city's going to be not just totally empty, but the captivity is going to last for 70 years. And so if you take that original 606, then the Babylonian Empire falls, the Persians come in, and then in 536, God brings the people back. And so after the time of the exile, the Feast of Purim comes along. And if you read the last part of the book of Esther, this is talking about God's deliverance of the people. Esther becomes the queen. The adversary gets hung on his own gallows. And it's a feast of great rejoicing, sending of food and presents to friends. We had a fabulous fourth grade Bible class teacher at Eastside, and she worked and worked and worked. And she called me one day and she said, I need to read you something out of my book. Will you please tell me this is not true? I said, well, read first and then we'll see what happens. Well, in a lot of Jewish circles, when the Feast of Purim took place, the people would have wine with them, and they would be drinking while the book of Esther is read. And then one half of the congregation, every time you hear the word Mordecai, you cheer. And the other side, every time you hear the word Haman, you boo. And you can imagine by the time you read the book of Esther and people keep drinking wine, then the boos get louder and the cheers get longer. And she said, please tell me they didn't do this. And I said, well, I can't tell you that. I don't know what you want to tell your fourth graders, but in time, that's what began to happen. And that's a part of how they celebrated the Feast of Purim. And this is going to be a very important remembrance of God's deliverance. The Feast of Dedication or Lights or Hanukkah is going to take place, and we looked at this when the Maccabean rebellion takes place. The Syrian Antiochus Epiphanes, who he called himself the Bright One, and the Jews changed the letter and called him the Mad One. Then he goes from Syria down to Egypt, and he's going to sneak in and take over Egypt, but a Roman general is there. The Roman general takes his sword, draws a circle in the sand, and says, before you step out, you either go home or you fight us. And so he's really ticked off and really upset. So he goes back to Jerusalem and offers a pig, a sow, on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem, among other things. And this sparks the Maccabean revolt, the Maccabean rebellion. And one date is 167. Some will put them a little bit later. But they eventually, it's a guerrilla warfare against larger forces, but the Jews finally win, and they take over Jerusalem, and they're able to cleanse the temple. And so when you come across the term Hanukkah, it's on the 25th of December, and they begin to celebrate this 167, some will say a little bit later, but in the 160s BC, and has nothing to do with Christmas whatsoever. But again, it's this celebration in that they finally were able to come back, take over the temple and cleanse it, and that's a major celebration. Then we've mentioned this, there's a sabbatical year. The land is to rest for a year every 7th year, so that it becomes some more periodical things. And then the year of Jubilee. And when you read Jesus standing up in the synagogue in Luke chapter 4 and reads this prophecy from Isaiah 61, the year of release and the year of rejoicing. This is a very significant year. At the Day of Atonement, on the 49th year, they sound a trumpet, and there is a period of freedom. And so if you buy property from people who inherited it, you bought it based on the price until the next year of Jubilee, and the property returned to the original owners on the 50th year. So therefore, the next year, if you buy property, then you're buying the next 50 years, 49 years, until the next Jubilee. And as long as God's people kept that, that's what they did. And sowing and reaping was forbidden during this particular time. So if you turn the page, then this is what we've looked at, but look at the dates. I just did some in terms of a tentative. It will change with different years, but here's a given year just to give you the proximity of the dates. October 1st and 2nd, Feast of Trumpets, beginning of this religious year. October 10th, Day of Atonement. And then 15 through 21 is Tabernacles, booths, ingathering, it will be called. And then they're going to celebrate Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights, on December 25th. March the 15th is the Feast of Purim. And then on this particular year, it was April 14th through 21 is the Feast of Passover, and then the 7 days of unleavened bread. And then the Feast of Pentecost is June the 6th. And by the time we come back to October, then that's when the new year actually begins. And I think it's just helpful for us just to kind of see where these events took place and where they happened, and to notice these. If you look at 5:1, I just find these kinds of things interesting. Look at the patterns of 7. The Sabbath day is 1 day of rest in 7. And let me just mention this. In reading about different groups and doing this, because just the mentality that I was raised with, if you rest, you're lazy. That has just been hard to kind of deal with. If you take times off, you should always be doing something. But I read it, and we're back in wagon and pioneer days, the Oregon Trail. But in reading about this, there were two groups of people who were making the trip westward. And one group, and they would observe the Saturday, one group took every Saturday off, and they rested. They might work a little bit on the wagons and everything else, but the people and the animals rested. The other group left them in the dust, laughing at them and how silly they were because they took a day off. But guess what happened when they got to the mountains? The people who had pushed every day and never rest, their animals were tired, they didn't have good repair, and the group who rested every Saturday, when they got to the mountains, passed them and left them in the dust because they were taking 1 day off to rest, both animals and physically and otherwise. And it's just maybe a shortcoming on my part. I thought, okay, I get it. If by resting you can get more done in the long run, then you can see God's wisdom in doing that. And that's why I think that's something significant for us to think about in our own lives. So we've mentioned 5:2, but we've just said the festivals are associated with the harvest. And let's keep going. Here's 5:3. Israel was dependent on agricultural. Drought, rain were primary concerns, and the people were totally dependent upon God. And as long as they worshiped the Lord and didn't fall into idolatry, which happens so often, then they were blessed and they came into this promised land. But here's 5:4, and we've done this previous, so we'll go through this very quickly. Passover is at the beginning of barley harvest. Barley is going to ripen quicker than the wheat. And when you read the book of Ruth, then Naomi and Ruth return after the loss of her husband. Milon, Chilon are going to die, and they come back, and Ruth starts working in the barley harvest in Boaz's fields. And if she's working in the barley harvest, it's not going to be long until Passover comes along. And the people are told, when you come to this festival, you don't come empty-handed. Guys, we're to go to Jerusalem, wherever we are, 3 times a year, celebrate this. And so when you go through Passover, then you're associated with the barley harvest. It ripens earlier. Then, 50 days later, the wheat is going to be ripening, and Pentecost is the celebration of the wheat harvest. And as these things take place, the harvest is going to come, the celebration is going to take place. And living here on the prairie, there are people who start cutting wheat in Texas and will cut all the way to Canada. They'll go all the way through as the crop ripens as you head north. And we always had 300 acres of wheat. That was just, Dad did 300 acres of cotton and 300 acres of wheat. And then we did cattle and everything else. When the wheat harvest comes, you don't do anything else till it's in the barn, because you only have to look to the southwest and see those dark clouds forming. And I wasn't here yet, but my sister said, and this actually was cotton, but the tallest cotton crop they ever had, they were so proud, and on. And that hailstorm came from the southwest, and the next morning there wasn't anything higher than the top of your shoe. And it was just literally just beaten in the ground. And my sister said, the most fervent prayers I've ever heard in my life were uttered by my mom and dad after the crop was just devastated by the hail. And so when the wheat harvest, when it starts turning that golden brown, everything's put on hold until that's done. Well, if we're in an agricultural society in the first century, just look at the celebration when we finish with the wheat harvest and we get all of that finished. Then the Feast of Ingatherings, Booths, and Tabernacles is also a reminder that they lived in those. But we have brought in the fall harvest, the fruit, the vineyards, all of those other things are completely finished. And so the three major festivals coincide with the agricultural cycle in the year as it unfolds. Here's what we're going to close with. And look at the word celebrate. This is what's significant to me, is that with the struggle of keeping the law, with all the requirements, and I'm not trying to be cynical when I say this, but I think one of the benefits of reading through the law of Moses is to thank God we don't have to do all that today. I mean, literally, you look at all those different ceremonies and things that happen and that were part of that covenant, and who would want to go back to that? But when they kept the covenant as God gave it, look at how the entire year is punctuated with these festivals and these seasons, and there's a primary word that's here. 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, celebrate the Feast of Harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your land, celebrate the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year when you gather your crops from your fields. And I still think it's interesting, just to me, that the first time the word joy and rejoicing is used outside of the sons of men and the angels rejoicing in creation, which would have happened in Genesis 1. The first time joy and rejoicing is used, it's on occasion of God's people gathering together to keep one of these feasts. And I know a lot goes on in our lives. I know a lot happens to us. But one of the parts of God's wisdom of us gathering together, whether it's first day of the week or other times, is just to anticipate the joy of being with God's family and sharing that time together. When our children were small, and we still say this when we're around them, but when our children were small, one of the things we would talk about on Saturday is that we need to get ready because tomorrow's the best day of the week. And we would always have something either different or something special or something that we normally didn't have on Sunday. And we had 3 rugrats that were just right after each other. And I would try to get up early. If I'm doing a lesson, get the lesson in my head. We would wake everybody up and we would have a special breakfast because today's the best day of the week. We get to go be with God's family. And of all the things that we do this week, this is the best day of the week. And then Sheila would lay the clothes out, and I said, I'll get all of them ready, get everything ready. You have the rest of the time for yourself to do that. And then we're going to try to get there and have some sense of sanity and catch our breath by the time we get 3 small kids to church. One Sunday we got to the door, and we just locked the door, and our middle daughter, just messed all over herself and Sheila. We'd just gotten outside. We were just getting ready to leave. And Sheila said, I'm going to crawl in the shower, and I'm going to hand out dirty clothes and eventually a clean girl, and you get her redressed, and then we're going to start all over, and if you've had small kids, you know what I'm talking about. It can just be a real challenge just to get here. And sometimes I can see a young mother, and she finally sits down, and you can kind of see her going, we got here. But here's what's important. They're not going to be little very long. You're going to turn around, and they're going to be trying to get a driver's license. And the attitude that we have toward worship is one of the most important things we can leave with the next generation. And from the Old Testament, they were to celebrate when they worshiped. And I would suggest that's an important prototype for us all these years later. Yes, sir. Yes, I don't know that I know all the answers to that, but just when I looked at it, some people will talk about a civil calendar and a religious calendar. And the civil calendar is the one that we looked at, and you would think the religious calendar would be the other way. This is my guess, okay? I think by the time you have Alexander the Great, who's going to come in from 333, he's going to die somewhere probably about 323, he's just going to be conquering for 10 years. Hellenism is going to be a part of the Jewish way of life for over 300 years. And then the Romans just come along and put a Roman cloak around everything that's Greek. And because they're surrounded by Greco-Roman background, then that's a part of where, and that's what we're the most familiar with, then there's where your two calendars come in. Before the coming of Alexander and before the coming of the Romans, they then would have thought in terms of the new year starting in October. But then by the time that they're conquered and you have that 300 years, then I think our calendar became a part of their routine as well. Yes? Yes. Yes. And that's why I just wanted you to kind of see this. And like I said, I picked dates for a year and just to say for a year. And this will vary with the times of the Passover, but still to give you a proximity. And I think it's just helpful to see this is the schedule. This is what they did through the whole year. And as we come across those and read those, we'll have a little bit of context where they took place. We need to let you go. Have a good evening. God bless.